Hello, everybody. Just hold on 1 second. We're going to wait for the YouTube live stream to sync up, and then we'll roll in about 10 seconds. All right. I think we're good to go.
All right, we're good.
Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Thursday Night Bulwark. I am your host, Jonathan Last. I am joined here tonight by my colleagues, Charlie Sykes and Ben Parker, and our very special guest, Elliot Cohen, who I will introduce in a moment for real. I just want to say welcome to all of our Bulwark Plus members. Thanks for being with us, guys. And also welcome to the people who are joining us through the YouTube simulcast. This is made possible only by the awesome people who have decided to become members of Bulwark Plus. And it is their support which is letting us open up this live stream to everybody. Normally it's locked. But while we have a pretty important world event going on, and while we have an incredibly helpful guest here in Elliot Cohen, we wanted to share it with everyone, because as I am constantly telling people, you can't save democracy from behind a paywall. So let's get starting tonight. We are joined by Elliot Cohen, who really needs no introduction. He has served at the highest levels of government. He was the Dean of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is, most importantly, one half of our outstanding foreign policy podcast, The Shield of the Republic, along with Eric Edelman. And Elliot, thank you so much for agreeing to join us tonight.
Well, Jonathan, it's good to be with you. Let me apologize for somewhat scratchy voice. I do have to have one correction. I'm a recovering dean.
Oh, recovering dean.
Yes.
Good. Well,
I'm back to being a professor again.
Outstanding. So, Elliot, we're just going to play pepper here with you. And I want to start with a really sort of broad level setting question, which is, how do we know what's really happening in Ukraine? And I don't mean, the stupid Russian disinformation about biological weapons, stuff like that. But when we see wildly varied casualty estimates, who should we be watching? What news sources should we be looking at? And how do we just sort of begin to make even preliminary sense of the events on the ground?
Well, something I wrestle with every day. I think the first thing is you have to accept that what Clausewitz called the fog of war lies as thick over these battlefields as it did over any Napoleonic era battlefield. It's very, very hard to figure things out. That said, it's really quite remarkable how much information is out there, not just specialist commentators, but these open source intelligence sites and so forth. I'll just tell you what I do, which is I probably am getting most of my information from my Twitter feed. I look carefully at the Post and the Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, plus some of the other mainline news sources. And then I have people that I follow, and I see who they're following. And, if you take the time to look at those feeds, you can get a sense of where they're coming from and what they know and what they don't know. And you can have kind of impressionist takes. So, for example, you watch a lot of videos of some of these ambushes of Russian columns. If you know something about military affairs, you say, wow, the Russians really have very poor discipline in terms of moving large numbers of armored vehicles around. I don't see helicopters overhead keeping overwatch. I don't see infantry out securing the roadsides. I don't see good spacing of the vehicles. And lo and behold, they get pummeled. But at the end of the day, I think you have to have a certain amount of humility. Just accept that you're not, the lot of stuff you won't know. I will say, after a while, as you immerse yourself in this stuff, you'll begin to see that there's some areas of consensus that emerge. So, for example, casualty estimates. The United States military says, the Pentagon says 2,000 to 4,000. The Brits actually are kind of more beyond the higher end of that. I think they're saying around 5,000 killed. And you can do some basic arithmetic because usually there's several times more people wounded than killed. That's 15,000, more or less. That's a big number. You can, so you can make something of that. But as I said, you've got to. I think one last thing I would say is be very wary of the maps you see out there. There's a problem that sometimes the military refers to as big hand, small map, when people are making wild gestures. We're dealing with a country that's a little bit smaller than Texas, that's bigger than France. And so these big kind of orange blobs that you say, well, these are areas that the Russians control. No, they don't. I mean, they run tanks through them. That's not the same thing as actually controlling them. So I would be wary of the maps that you see. But for the rest, I think you just have to kind of plunge in and gradually form your own judgments.
Okay, so before I pass this off to Charlie and Ben, where are we right now? The sense that I have, and maybe this is incorrect, in which case I hope you'll correct me, is that the Russians have made gains of some sort in the south and east. It is unclear how strong those gains are, but they do at least seem to have been moving. They seemed on the brink of Odessa, but haven't committed to actually moving towards Odessa in an attempt to capture it. But they seem to be much more competent, or at least getting more forward momentum and results through the southeast part of the country, up especially in the north and west and around Kyiv. They seem to be bogged down, and depending on who you're looking at, there are moments when it looks like this could in theory be an army on the verge of disintegration, depending on logistics, right? I mean, the old aphorism is that amateurs do tactics and professionals do logistics. And so a big question is, can all of those forces which are deployed not in the south and the east, can they keep still getting supplied? Are there enough trucks, to bring parts and oil and food, and petrol off to the Russian front lines? What does it look like to you right now?
So look, it's striking. There are a couple of things that's striking. They're on the outskirts of some big cities, Kharkiv and Kiev in particular. They haven't actually taken a single major city. I mean, they've reduced Mariupol to a wreck, and they are resorting to these kind of terror bombings of these cities. They haven't actually taken one. When they do try to take one, they'll discover the old lesson of World War II, which is ruins make good fighting positions. I mean, they'll kill and maim vast numbers of civilians. It's appalling. It's war crimes. But that's not where the fighting is going to stop. I think, in the south and east, they've had a little bit more luck, but only a little bit more luck because they're nearer their bases of supply, particularly in Crimea. The issues, I think, are not just logistical. So one thing that's fascinating, if you follow some of the kind of geeky open source intel, but this seems to be confirmed by other sources, a lot of the equipment that they're losing is abandoned, not destroyed. And that means people are running away from it. So I think there's good reason to suspect that part of the Russian problem is a very substantial morale problems. First, the army didn't know what war was going to go fight. Secondly, they ran into an enormous amount of resistance, and they've taken, even by the lower American estimates, they've taken heavy casualties. There's clearly been all kinds of follow-ups in terms of logistics, but just very basic coordination, combined arms, getting our artillery support. They haven't really been able to integrate air power into their ground operations. So I think the thing is, you may be dealing with an army that large parts of which are demoralized, and where the command and control is not particularly effective. And so who knows? I mean, they could roll into downtown Kharkiv tomorrow, although I doubt it. But I think it's as likely that you'll see some pretty dramatic collapses of some Russian units as that you'll see the triumphant occupation of some Ukrainian cities. I mean, nobody knows. I don't know. But I'm just saying the range of possibilities is actually pretty wide here. I think, the Russians don't really have reserves that they can throw in behind the elements that they've committed. They're not going to call up reservists, and the reservists, it's not like the National Guard, that trains 30, 40 days a year.
Right.
Haven't worn a uniform in a long time. So it's an army that's really, I think, very badly stretched.
All right, before I turn it over to Charlie and Ben, I just want to say to the Bulwark Plus members on the Zoom, please leave questions for Professor Cohen here. Don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, which is the button right next to the chat, right down there. I have a whole passel of questions from readers who have already sent them to me, and so I will try to get some that are also given here in the live stream. Charlie.
Well, I want to talk about this whole fiasco with giving the jets to the Ukrainians. I have a couple of questions about that. Number one, why the West, NATO, the United States is making such a strong distinction between jets on the one hand, which would escalate the conflict, and giving all of these other missiles, tank destroying weapons, lethal drones. That apparently is okay, but not the jets. And before we get to that, also, by what right, I guess, or why would we recognize any legitimacy of Russia declaring basically that the airspace over Ukraine, a sovereign country that they do not control, that they have closed the airspace? Do you follow my question here? Yeah. I mean, the first thing is that, we should have freedom of the skies, just like we used to have freedom of the seas. We went to war for that in World War I. And yet there seems to be this recognition, well, Vladimir Putin has closed the skies over Ukraine, and therefore we cannot fly in there without making him mad. I want to get your take on the way this is playing out.
So let me separate out the two questions. On the MiG-29 issue, I think there were three different things going on. One is there's a body of opinion in the Pentagon that actually this would not be particularly useful for the Ukrainians, that it would take longer than they might think for them to learn how to operate these MiG-29s, which are somewhat different models than the ones they currently have. I'm not sure they're confident that they would be able to survive that well against some of the air defense systems that the Russians have. So there's a military technical argument. Right. I can't really judge it, but there's that. There's the second set of argument, but that part is sort of legitimate. The second part is, it's that escalatory one, that this could take you into a war with Russia, and we don't want that. I completely agree with you. I mean, my view is, javelins kill Russians, stingers kill Russians, rifles kill Russians. This is just another way of killing Russians. I mean, it's not escalating to nuclear war. It's not using chemicals. So I think that argument is silly. And that's, this is a game we always play with ourselves, where we negotiate with ourselves. Yeah. We deter ourselves. There's a third piece of this, though, which is that some bad communication within the United States government. So for me, the main thing here is that Tony Blinken on Face the Nation said, oh yeah, we've green-lighted this. We're going to go ahead and try to make it happen. And John Kirby, the press secretary, no, we think it's a terrible idea. The thing, until this point, actually, I've really admired how the Biden administration has handled this. I think they've done a lot of things really very, very well. But this gave me that queasy feeling, not that you're going to see what happened in Afghanistan over the summer again, but it's a result of a weak NSC, which is that stuff is supposed to get hammered out in the Situation Room in the White House. And you don't have the Defense Department taking one view and the State Department taking another. And then I think the polls kind of announced something, and people got their noses out of joint. So, it's really unfortunate. I think it ended up people getting annoyed. The polls got annoyed at us. We got annoyed at the polls. I think everybody's missing one big argument, which they're missing in the Pentagon, which I tried to make is, even if you don't think it will do any good, psychologically, you want the Ukrainians to think we will do everything in our power, short of simply going to war with Russia, to give you a chance. So even if those MiG-29s don't do a damn thing, even indeed if, God forbid, the Ukrainian pilots flying them, get shot down and have to parachute somewhere in Ukraine, it's still worth doing, because war is as much about what happens in your head as what happens in the battlefield. So I think the administration blew it. Look, and people talk about no-fly zone, so really there you're talking about war with Russia. And I think, I don't think the Europeans are quite ready for that. I don't think most Americans are ready for that.
Well, could I ask a follow-up though on that? So, there are some people who have been suggesting a humanitarian limited no-fly zone. We've had a lot of talk. Okay, we've had a lot of talk about Lend-Lease. I was thinking of the Berlin airlift the other day. What if Kyiv is surrounded? People are starving. There's a need to get them supplies. Is our position now that we are going to acknowledge Vladimir Putin's control over the skies, and we will not be flying anything in? There will be no Kyiv airlift. There will be no relief of Odessa from the air, because we're afraid that Vladimir Putin would regard that as an escalation?
I think we won't do that, because there is no such thing as simply a humanitarian corridor, no-fly zone. You really have to be willing to suppress enemy air defenses, which means you got to kill the people on the ground, blow up their equipment, and you're going to shoot down Russian airplanes. So you should not embark on any of those things unless you're willing to undertake a substantial air operation that will get you into a shooting war with Russia. Now, some people are willing to take that risk, and I understand that. I suspect that the judgment that the administration is working from is that in Putin, they're dealing with somebody who's not entirely rational on this subject, and you could have him lighting off some nukes and escalating this in ways that are unpredictable. Now, I think we may come to blows with the Russians in some other way. If they begin using chemical weapons, for example, which is entirely possible, then I could see the pressure for us to do something kinetic could be overwhelming.
You raised this other central question: Is Vladimir Putin right now a rational actor? How should we be regarding him at the moment?
I think he's rational, but not in the way that you and I would understand rational. I mean, he's rational in that he has a certain view of the world. He has a certain view of Russia. He has a certain view of the interests of his regime. He's working from a lot of very bad information and very distorted information. And he's showing very poor judgment. But I don't think he's simply a raving lunatic. He's, on the other hand, in one way, we've clearly exaggerated the extent to which he's a very careful calculator. I was at the Munich Security Conference and then in Warsaw, literally just before the war started. I left the day the war started. And it was amazing to me how many people said, he's not actually going to do this.
Yeah.
Or if he does, it'll be like, Jonathan, what you were talking about, a land corridor, in the south, or some such thing. And so his appetite for risk is very different than ours. But above all, I mean, he's proceeding from assumptions, not just about us, about what he thinks of as our weakness, certainly what he thought of as Ukrainian weakness. He's proceeding from some real misunderstandings of his own strength. He's poured vast sums of money into the Russian military for 20 years. And nobody's going to tell him a lot of that was wasted on corruption. Nobody's going to tell him, despite all that money, this is still a military where, the more senior enlisted beat the daylights out of the junior enlisted and steal from them. And, all that stuff, which we know is true and which is seriously hampering their military effectiveness. So he's operating, I think, under a lot of false premises.
Ben.
Sure. I want to get back to the no-fly zones for a minute, because I think in a large part these suggestions seem to be solutions to the wrong problem. You mentioned at the very beginning that the Russian Air Force hasn't been doing everything that we were afraid it was going to do. That it doesn't control the skies, and that I think that a lot of the humanitarian catastrophe we're seeing is the result of Russian artillery, Russian rockets, Russian cruise missiles. So my question isn't, no-fly zone wouldn't solve those, but is there anything we can do about that? Is there anything we can do to maintain humanitarian safe areas, to give people a place to go that is safe? Anything at all?
Not really. I think what we can do, most important thing we can do is we can give them the most sophisticated weaponry that they can handle in unlimited quantities. And we can tighten absolutely every screw on the economy to speed up the day that the Russian economy simply collapses. And we do everything possible to strengthen the frontline states. But I don't think we're going to be able to carve out humanitarian corridors. Now, one thing I should say, by the way, is, it is possible for Americans to kill Russians and there to be no war. American and Russian pilots shot at each other in Korea. They shot at each other in Vietnam. And then much more recently, in Syria, there was this large-scale attack on one of our special forces outposts by the Wagner Group, which is really just a commercialized version of Russian Special Operations Forces, Spetsnaz. And we killed a couple hundred of them, and nothing happened. So it is not necessarily the case that if the Americans kill a bunch of Russians, that it becomes thermonuclear war. But I understand, if you're a policymaker, you're thinking, well, what's the nature of the risk and can I accept that? And also, what is it that my allies will be willing to accept too, which is an important consideration.
Right. JVL, can I ask one more question before we get to the
Please.
So thanks. So it seems to me like Putin hasn't had a really good day since he filmed that video dressing down Nikolai Patrushev, and that sort of every day since the invasion, the operation really started has been bad. What can we do to make his life worse? What can we do to confuse him, to make his decisions harder, to make him choose between paying attention to Ukraine and paying attention to something else he values, to tighten the screws, as you said?
I think anything that you can do to get that economy to collapse. So, and I think, by the way, it means playing hardball with all kinds of people. So Deutsche Bank, for example, has not left Russia yet. Put the screws to Deutsche Bank, say you want to do business in the United States, get out of Russia. You want to be in Russia, don't do business in the United States. Really, so everything possible to accelerate that. And then I wouldn't underestimate the amount of pressure he'll be under if the Russian military begins to crack in Ukraine. Because he'll have to, already there's indications that people are aware that that there have been a lot of casualties. The Russian military advances with mobile crematoria. And in some cases, they don't return the bodies at all. But, can you imagine that in an American context? And people are learning of, people being killed. And I think they assume that their government lies, but they're learning about it. So, it's brutal, but I think you just have to ramp up the pressure on both fronts. And, make no mistake about it, it's going to cause a lot of suffering for people who had no part in this decision. But unfortunately, that's the nature of the world we're in. If I were in Congress, the thing I would be overseeing closely is the scale of our support to the Ukrainians and the urgency with which we're doing it. I quoted this in a piece I had in the Atlantic. My friend Mike Vickers, who ran the Afghan insurgency against the Russians, it wasn't until about 1985, I think, when we, really ramped up aid to the Mujahideen that the Russians began to get hammered. So its scale and urgency are really the key things here.
All right, Professor, let's talk about nukes, because we are going to have to at some point anyway. When you look at Putin's options, I mean, one is to try to get to some sort of negotiated settlement, although I think that's very difficult for him. Another is to try to simply bludgeon Ukraine into submission, just, pound things with enough dumb munitions that there's not a lot of rubble left, and then hope that he breaks the will of the people. I think that probably is going to be very, very hard for him to achieve. So another pathway for him is escalation. Right. Escalation could take any number of forms. It could take the form of chemical weapons. It could take the form of cyber attacks on the West, or it could take the influence of a nuke. What are we supposed to do about this? When policymakers game this out, and Chris Chivas wrote a piece for the Carnegie people yesterday, the day before, saying that there's been a lot of simulations of war games on what happens if there's a tactical nuke deployed against a quasi-military target in Ukraine. The idea being not to actually achieve anything tactically with it, but just as a look at this, I'm serious, I'll do it. Warning to NATO, in the hope that he can escalate to de-escalate. What do you make of all of this? And to what extent because this is the other thing. I mean, we will have one view of how to respond to this in America. Poland will have another one, right? I mean, this is, you have this alliance with where some countries are very close to Russia, and some countries have long histories of antagonism with them, and others are a little bit more removed. What is our preparedness, and what does our game theory tell us to do here?
Well, game theory is very interesting. I did coursework with Tom Schelling, who was one of the people who invented it. And that's not how you think your way through one of these crises, because it's going to depend on the personalities, on other things that are going on in the world, on the precise circumstances. And, that's why I was not particularly taken with the Chris Chivas piece, because war games are not surrogate history. They're not. This is what would have happened if this had happened in the real world. They are by nature profoundly artificial. They don't usually involve the actual people who are going to really make the decisions. They involve, people like me. But if I'm not in government, I'm in a very different place. Compressed time, lots and lots of things that make it artificial. War games are useful for thinking through a problem, but that's it. They're not surrogate history. That's the first point I'd make. Second point is, if there's probably a difference between a nuke that kills people and one that doesn't. One that doesn't, you can imagine responses that are firm without being violent. So say, okay, in that case, we're willing to have dual key nuclear weapons in Poland. We're going to give the Poles 100 tactical nuclear weapons, some which that can reach Moscow. It'll be under a dual key system, but the Russians really won't like that. You say, well, that's the price you pay. If it actually does damage, then I think it gets seriously sporty. You cannot, I think in the crunch, an American president will realize, if I fold on this one, they will always be able to get what they want by deploying a nuclear weapon against something. Always. And not just the Russians, but the Chinese or the North Koreans. So I think then things get really quite exciting, much more exciting than any of us would wish. The other kinds of escalation, there's cyber wars going on all the time. It's going on right now. The only thing is, we do systematically underestimate ourselves. And in the same way that it turns out we actually knew very well, where all of his forces were in the lead up to this, and I think did a brilliant job of leaking that. We can do a lot of cyber stuff to them too, and probably worse, a lot worse. We keep our offensive capabilities under wraps. And in a certain way, we've been lucky because we've had to go through so much, ransomware hacks and all those sorts of things, plus governmentally directed things, that actually has kind of helped you to build up some of your defenses in a way. So I think we're probably better off than we were 5 years ago. But I think there is a chance he's going to try to escalate. And the problem is, if I'm right, he's running out of conventional power. And so the way he's going to escalate would be with different forms of weapons or trying to broaden the conflict. I think one thing I could imagine doing, for example, fire a bunch of cruise missiles at some base in Poland, which is where we're transshipping weapons into Ukraine. And the logic of doing that would be the Poles would say, okay, Article 5, attack against one is an attack against all. All you NATO countries come to our defense. And what Putin might hope is the Germans would say, well, we think it's ambiguous or something like that. I think he'd be misjudging look, everybody misjudged the Germans. Everybody. I did.
Yeah.
That the socialist chancellor would say, right, okay, now we have to make the 2% spending targets, and we're going to spend double the Bundeswehr's annual budget in 1 year. That's amazing. That's amazing. And canceling Nord Stream 2 and so on. So what I'd be really interested in is if I could crawl inside his head, which is probably an unpleasant place to be, is what did he make of the Germans? Because that's a country he knows, or he thought he knew. He's fluent in German, It's where he was stationed in East Germany as a young KGB officer.
Do we have confidence that the chain of command for the use of tactical nukes in Russia would work? I mean, again, we've seen so much.
Yeah,
things have not looked great, just in terms of blocking and tackling for them.
I don't.
What do you think? We don't know.
I think we don't know. There's a lot of good history about different nuclear crises of the Cold War. There's one particularly scary moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis where, a Russian submarine could have decided to start World War III. I suspect in the event, you can't rely on this, but I suspect that in the event, you'll get people. What's the factory term? Working to just to the sort of the minimum that you need to do. I think you get a lot of passive resistance, but I may be wrong. And what we don't know, working to rule, I think that's what it's called. I think also that's the point at which some of the people around him might say this is just too dangerous. It was clear from that truly crazy session he had with his Security Council, where he was chewing out Sergei Narishkin, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. These guys are nervous. They're not particularly happy about this. I think they have a better sense of reality than he does. And some of them have to be thinking, this is just not a good idea.
So how secure is this? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Charlie. Go ahead.
As we're going through all of this, we're sort of, piling up the things that we don't know. We don't know what his intentions are. We don't know how he's going to react. We don't know how the chain of command will work. We don't even know, by the way, if the nuclear arsenal is in better shape than the conventional arsenal here. Is that one of the reasons why NATO seems to be adopting this very, very cautious approach right now? Because there are just so many unknowns. I mean, nobody seems to have any idea how this thing ends. Or even what's going to happen over the next week. I mean, this discussion of Germany that we're having right now, this was completely unexpected, and so I just give me a sense, because it feels like we are flying. We always fly blind, but it feels like we're flying particularly blind at the moment.
So various, there may be certain kinds of technical things which people in the government know, which are not public. When I was in government, I never got into what's our understanding of the Russian nuclear system.
Yeah.
But there may be people who know it. If they do know it, they would have learned about it from very, very sensitive intelligence collection means. So it's restricted and, it just won't be out in the public. But I think, the way I usually think of myself is I'm a military historian. This is all completely normal.
Okay.
It's not like 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, we knew how we were going to win the war. It's
normal except for the nukes and the chemical weapons and.
Well, but it's just that those things now exist. And they didn't exist before. I think this is, I keep on looking fondly at my copy of Karl von Clausewitz's On War, which I've taught to my students for 35 years. And I'm thinking, boy, he might have written in Napoleonic times, but he's absolutely right. And that's what this is what he says war is all about. It's that, there's this fog that covers it. And about 3/4 of the decisions you have to make are made under conditions of profound uncertainty. And that's why, say somebody else who really wrote very knowledgeably about war, Winston Churchill, when he talked about the qualities that you need, it wasn't, absolutely comprehensive knowledge of what's going on, because he understood you can't know what's going on. It's things like judgment and character and things like that. So you cannot be sure that you're right about anything. And you just need a certain amount of fortitude to accept that and drive on.
JVL, are you muted? You might be muted.
Sorry, I want to move on to talk about off ramps and end games, but a couple questions from the Q&A over here. David asks, Elliot, just how fragile would the European coalition be when Putin eventually pulls back? And I think this is a real question about how durable are the sanctions, right? The sanctions regime we have is quite good and quite aggressive right now. But if Russia were to pull back 25% or to pretend like they're taking the negotiations seriously, but demand that the sanctions be winched back 3% or something, how are there NATO partners that are going to look to jump at that, or is the coalition pretty durable, do you think?
I mean, at the moment, I think the coalition looks pretty good, but these things are always contingent on leadership. And European leadership, but also our leadership. And it's contingent on the president's relationship with his counterparts, the Secretary of States, Secretary of Defense. And that's why it's really important to try to have really full and complete mutual understanding. But I do think there's been a sea change in European opinion. This is very different. It has a very different feel from all the other crises. I was in government working for Condi Rice when we had the Georgia episode. And you could tell, after we went to Tbilisi, we went to Brussels. And you could tell that they were uneasy about what had happened, but they weren't really ready yet. This is 2008, to say we've got a really big problem here. Whereas now I think they're ready to say we've got a really big problem here. And one of the dinners I was at, it was in Munich. It was stunning to me. I sat next to the head of the German Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. This guy's from the Green Party. He was very tough on Russia. He had no illusions about Russia. He was tougher than the SPD, the socialists.
Wow.
He was as tough as the Christian Democrats. And now there's a part of the Green Party there, which is not that way. But, I thought, wow, that's not what I expected. I want to come back to humility, because so many people have been so wrong, and I'm wrong about a lot of things too. We need to keep on reminding ourselves. I mean, how many people said, Zelensky, he's a comic. I had people tell me, oh, he's going to run to his apartment in London. And, turns out he's a formidably brave and eloquent war leader. Wrong about Putin, wrong. A lot of people wrong about the Russian military. A lot of people wrong about Ukrainian will to resist them. European will to resist. Sophistication of the American response. This is war is the occasion which forces you to re-examine a lot of your preconceptions, a lot of your assumptions about how the world works.
Matthew asks, are there any realistic exit ramps for Putin at this point? And do you think that there are concessions that Zelensky could offer him, and by could I mean that would be politically viable for him to offer, that might find a way to get to a negotiated solution?
Well, I suppose you could imagine something which would look like this. Ukraine formally accepts the annexation of Crimea. Maybe accepts the loss of part of the Donbass. But Ukraine has the government remains intact. Ukraine has the right to do whatever it wants to internationally, and there are no constraints on its ability to rearm. And the Russians withdraw. That's a theoretical proposition that I could imagine Zelensky accepting, in the interest of just limiting the damage that's being done. But do I think that's likely to happen? Probably not. I'm not sure there's an off-ramp for Vladimir Putin. I think the off-ramp may be, he wakes up one day and he's under arrest. I really, you're dealing with a guy who's 70 or almost 70, absolute power for 20 years, who is a Russian nationalist, who doesn't understand Ukraine, doesn't think Ukraine has a right to exist as a separate country, who is paranoid about color revolutions spreading into Russia, who is physically isolated from people. I mean, he's not in the Kremlin most of the time. He's in Valdai, this resort between Moscow and St. Petersburg. You've got to quarantine for a couple of weeks before you go see him. Those ridiculous long tables. He's not talking to many people. He's not getting around. So he's a guy who's, I think, not going to think clearly the way we would think somebody should think clearly.
Ben, do you have off-ramp and endgame questions here? Because I got dozens of them from readers, but I don't want to monopolize this.
I don't have off-ramp and endgame questions. I have questions about I'm trying to think optimistically, right? Almost like sort of was Apollo 13. It was like, don't tell me what doesn't work, tell me what does work. And I'm starting to get even thinking optimistically, I'm starting to get a little bit nervous about Zelensky's rhetoric towards the West, towards NATO, towards the United States. Totally understandable that he's annoyed that there are limits to what we will not do, cannot do. But is it possible that if this goes on long enough and he keeps on asking the West and the United States for things that we cannot give, like a no-fly zone, that actually Putin kind of wins and that the westward orientation of Ukraine ends because they just get so frustrated that we didn't help them enough?
Well, I mean, anything could happen, and we could blow it that thoroughly. But I think the thing is, the Russians have behaved with such cruelty and such criminality and such destructiveness. And that's on top of a long, long history that Ukrainians remember, going back a long, long way. That Ukrainian hatred for Russia is now what we used to call during the Cold War, one of the permanently operating factors that you have to deal with. I mean, and it's profound, and it extends to the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. I mean, this is part of the stupidity of what Putin has done. These people will hate him forever, and they'll fight him and fight Russia forever. And they have no desire to be part of that world. They have every desire to be part of our world. So I think there's that. Zelensky's under pressure, which I think is inconceivable to any of us. I can give you good news.
Please.
Well.
Oh no, sorry, we don't do that on this show.
Yeah. Well, I normally don't do it. So the first thing, just want to stipulate, the good news is being bought with the blood of Ukrainians, of women and children, and cities in flames and all that. So we owe them a lot. So here's the good news: there are things worth fighting for, and people will fight for them. Freedom is something real. People will fight to the death for that. That's something we should have always known, but we're being reminded of it. The West has kind of woken up to what lies out there to the east. The United States has, despite the MiG-29 thing, has actually exercised really rather good leadership throughout this, both in the run-up to the crisis and through it. Our terribly divided country, with Democrats and Republicans at each other's throats. I look at Capitol Hill, I don't see a big divide between Republicans and Democrats about the imperative of supporting the Ukraine, the Ukrainians, right?
For now.
I mean, it's really, in that respect, the Republicans are veering away from where Donald Trump was, which is a good thing. And I think if this ends with the Russian economy really destroyed, and the West being unified and rearmed, that's a good lesson for China. China will be watching this as well. So, but again, I just want to go back. This is all being bought with the blood of the people of Ukraine. And I think we have a moral obligation as well as kind of a political strategic one, not only to arm them as best we can to support them, but when this is over, to help them rebuild their country and to make it secure.
Amen. Charlie, do you want to push back on that political aspect of this on cap? Because I don't want to make too much of it, but also I get the sense that I'm kind of where you are.
Well, okay. I mean, I really want to agree with you, Elliot, about this, because at the moment, the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party is very, very isolated. I mean, you look at the public opinion polls, they're isolated from the elected officials as well. So you have the Madison Cawthorns out there saying how corrupt Ukraine is, and who rushes to the microphone, but Lindsey Graham saying, no, he doesn't speak for us. He doesn't speak for us. And you look at what happened over the last 24, 48 hours in terms of the votes, in terms of the support, and Republicans, are standing firm. However, I think where JVL is going there is we've seen this before. And I think it is worth remembering, number one, that yes, Madison Cawthorn may be a member of the Putin wing of the Republican Party, but the head of the Putin wing of the Republican Party is Donald J. Trump, who still controls that party and who is deeply, deeply invested in the narratives about how terrible Ukraine is, how corrupt Ukraine is. I mean, you go back, how many years these things have been talking points of the right? Everybody's saying now, well, Madison Cawthorn, he's crazy, he's nuts. Madison Cawthorn's looking around going, hey, guys, up until 5 minutes ago, we were all saying this stuff about Ukraine. So if the past is any indication, I guess our concern would be that you have this sort of January 7th rallying around saying this is terrible, everything has changed, and then things begin to revert to the normal tribal political world that we've come to live in. JVL, do you want to add some more?
No, that's about it. And also just, like sanctions are chemotherapy, right? Chemo kills kills the malignant cells, but it also kills the healthy cells. And you're just in a race to try to kill all the malignant cells first, right? And sanctions are going to hurt us, right? This is just basic economics. And I don't know, like how I just look at the political will in America. And what I keep coming back to is if you had said to me 3 years ago, there is a global shock of something which people had assumed could never happen again, would Americans polarize around it or would they come together? 3 years ago, I would have said, you know what, we're going to come together. We may look like a decadent people, but when the chips are down, we'll be good. And the experience of COVID has cured me of that. And watching the political reaction to COVID in America has made me very, very nervous about the ability of our political life to congeal around a big, important moment.
So, I mean, it is folly for me to argue domestic politics with you guys, because you're the guys I listen to when I want to understand domestic politics. You know, I'm just a poor, simple military historian. But let me offer just a little bit of pushback. So one difference from January 7th is every day for the last 2 weeks, and who knows, for the next couple of months, it's going to be January 6th. It's going to be those pictures on the TV every single day with people getting killed and maternity hospitals getting bombed, and it may get worse with chemical weapons. And that's just going to be a barrage to the senses. That's point one. Point two, I mean, in this way, and as you guys know, I was one of the original Never Trumpers. I'm no longer a Republican. I'm, just a political homeless person. I still retain my long-term optimism about the United States in that, I mean, I've always felt throughout this, and this is completely irrational, that we could go through a very bad decade or more, but we'll recover because we've gone through really bad times before. And I think, I do think we have sold ourselves short a little bit in that, we forget how much really bad stuff there's been in this country that we got past. And I don't just mean the Civil War. If you look at the 1920s, between the Red Scare and lynching and the anti-immigrant stuff, it was terrible. And then on top of that, the stupidity of prohibition.
Yeah.
And you could carry that through with in the 60s and so on. So and the truth is, I think this is actually one of the areas where Putin is making his biggest misjudgments, because he looks at those things and he says, okay, that's what the United States is. And he doesn't see the other stuff about the United States.
Right.
So, but like I said, I'm not going to argue politics.
No, that's fine. That's fine. We're coming up on time here. Ben and Charlie, do you guys have any questions you want to get in under the bell?
Ben?
Yeah, I've got one. We talked a little bit about how the Germans are going to add more to their defense budget next year than the entire Russian defense budget of last year, if my math is correct. And they're spending 2% and all of that. We also have some changes to make on our defense budget. Everyone who's listened to Shield of a Republic knows that. So I think you and Professor Edelman both endorsed $1 trillion defense budgets. But if you could go into the Pentagon or into OMB or the White House tomorrow and say, okay, here is my dictate. Here's what we should be spending on. Here's how we should do that. What would you do? I mean, how would you spend $1 trillion? What would you change about the way we defend ourselves in DOD or otherwise in light of what we learned in the past 2 weeks?
Well, I'll give you two different answers. One is, I mean, clearly there's an argument for keeping the heavy army around and basically having the kind of forces that can fight in Europe. But I would say, well, at the same time, we shouldn't learn from any of the stuff we've been doing in China. We just need a bigger military, so we need more of all of it. And you should accept the fact that that's wasteful. I think Ed Lookback once had a article, we need more waste, fraud, and abuse in the defense budget. And I agree with that. So, you just need to spend, you do need to spend a lot more. But I do think our role in Europe will be different. I think our role, instead of being the main provider of heavy forces, with during the height of the Cold War, we had over 300,000 troops there. We're not going to go back to that. We have 100,000, which is not nothing. But I think it'll be more that we provide the unique capabilities, we provide the integration. It's a somewhat different role, so there's that. But I would also say, if I could talk to the president, some of this is about resources and putting this at the center of the national agenda, which is up to him, and that's a presidential leadership thing. But part of it is also about developing a disciplined decision-making system that can deal with the fact that we're going to be deeply engaged in two theaters simultaneously. It's completely doable. We won World War II, didn't we? With a pretty big war in the Pacific and a pretty big war in Europe. But I think we have, for a whole bunch of reasons, we've just let ourselves get sloppy and undisciplined about how we manage crises so we can do only one thing at a time. And I remember there was this New York Times piece about Jake Sullivan, who's a very smart guy, very nice guy. He's the National Security Advisor. During the Afghan crisis, he's getting 2 hours of sleep a night. That to me is a sign of very bad decision making. That means you're undisciplined. That means, you're not delegating where you need to delegate. I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan with our forces there. One of the things that always impressed me about the Dave Petraeuses of this world, really any general that I would visit, very disciplined about sleep, very disciplined about you make a decision when you're going to make a decision. You don't let yourself be overwhelmed. And our central decision-making system just isn't doing a good enough job of that. And some of this is, it's Congress's fault as well. Making sure that you have appointees in all the major positions. Yeah. We're lucky that we got an ambassador into Poland a couple of weeks before this thing began. It would have been a lot better if he'd been there a year ago.
We still don't have one to Ukraine.
Right.
Amazing.
I mean, it's inexcusable. And, with a lot of these things, you can have all the muscle that you want, but if you don't have a brain that's capable of using it well, you're going to be in big trouble. In a very different way. That's part of the lesson of the Russian experience.
All right, Charlie, do you want the last word?
No, I'm just saying that even though you and I shared sort of a dark, less optimistic view, as I was listening to Elliot, the point about being on television day after day, I think is relevant. There's a couple of other things a couple of people in the chat mentioned. Opposing Russia is very much in the DNA of Republicans and conservatives.
Yeah.
And I hate to throw this in at the very, very end of the program, and I don't want to be misunderstood, but I think the ethnic identity of the Ukrainians will appeal to the Republican base in a way that people in the Middle East did not. I think that you're seeing a very different reaction to the refugees. I think they're looking at people and they sympathize with them in a way that I did not pick up during Iraq or Afghanistan. So maybe the dynamic of this is different than we've had before, but I certainly don't underplay the point you made about these images day after day. It's not one day. It is, relentless. And I think we would all agree it's going to continue and it will get worse. And as horrific as the pictures of the last few days have been, there will be even more horrific pictures over the next several weeks. So yeah, I certainly do not discount your pushback on our pessimism.
Yeah.
No. Great. Well, I'm going to let that be the last word. I cannot thank you enough for joining us tonight, Elliot. Everybody who's here, by the way, go and make sure you're subscribed to Elliot and Eric's podcast, Shield of the Republic. You can find it on the website, thebulwark.com. Thanks to all of the members who made this possible. Thanks to everybody who joined us on the YouTube simulcast. Guys, we will see you again next Thursday. Elliot, thank you so much. I hope you feel better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm better.
Good night, friends.
Thank you.
Good night,
Everybody.